I'm going to start. I noticed there's one thing in the chat. So it's from Jody. And so I'll let you say that in your own words in a few minutes. But I am going to start recording and let Kevin McGill do the introduction. So let me start let's see, how do I record it? Gumi, do you know how to start recording? Oh, okay, I see, here it is. Okay, it's gonna start recording now.
Recording in progress.
Well, good morning and welcome everyone. So glad to be able to be a part of this with you this morning. And another quick note on the Bonhoeffer presentation that will be coming next week. My friend Kevin Eckfall helped produce and direct that film. So he also just mentioned to me he's going to try to join the Sabbath School class next week for that discussion as well. I'm really thankful for the excellent presentations that this class has been able to have, and that will include today with Dr. Jody Washburn. She's one of my friends, and I'm thankful anytime that I have the opportunity to learn from, engage with her. I think she brings a authentic, scholarly take on understanding the Bible, and it's been a passion of hers for a very long time. Dr. Washburn's training is in the languages and cultures and stories of the world of the Bible. Her recent research interests include integrating research on compassion, attachment, and trauma into her teaching and writing of religious texts. Jody Washburn is an associate professor of Hebrew and Bible studies, biblical studies at Walla Walla University, focusing on Hebrew language, biblical studies, Levantine archaeology, and Christian theology. Professor Washburn received her undergraduate education at Walla Walla University and 2 MA degrees from Andrews University. She earned her PhD in Near Eastern Languages and Culture from the University of California, Los Angeles. Dr. Washburn is a Pacific Northwesterner, professor, writer, musician, and lifelong wanderer. She enjoys being outdoors with her family as often as possible. So Dr. Washburn, I'll hand it over to you. We enjoyed your lecture, interactive lecture last night, and I think we're thankful for this opportunity with the Sabbath School class, because I said you're going to get lots of questions, interaction, and so we encourage people to turn your video on, engage on chat, raise your hand, all of those things. But I'll let you explain anything you want to more on those lines, Jody. So the time is yours.
Well, thank you so much. It's wonderful to be with all of you. And you'll notice me, I have a cough drop tucked into my cheek here, and I have my tea and such. I'm recovering from a little cold my daughter brought home from school. And so I'm nursing my voice. So I will be grateful if we can interact, go back and forth a little bit. But this morning, I'm really interested in continuing the conversation of the Christian spiritual life as a journey toward shalom, or a journey toward wholeness, healing. And as part of that, reflecting on the way that compassion, as demonstrated by the life of Jesus, and also, in many ways throughout the entire biblical text, is a practice, a way of being in the world that allows us to proceed down that journey toward shalom, toward wholeness, in a way that is cultivating of connection to ourselves, to the people around us, and to God. And so this morning, we're going to focus on the topic of metaphor. I have to say that probably one of the biggest things that drew me to the Hebrew Bible is the language is very picture driven. So for instance, some of the more well-known examples are, instead of saying someone is angry, you say that they're two noses, right? Because we have 2 nostrils, 1 nose. Their 2 noses became like burning red. And that's just one example. There are many examples, but Hebrew is a very picture-driven language. And that way of using language that is very much built on our everyday lived experience, for me, just brings alive the text. There's always more depth there. One scholar, Susan Niditch, put it this way. She says, in the writings of the Hebrew Bible, the experiential shimmers. So in other words, every text sort of glistens. There's multiple facets of the experience of being human that come through in the text. Much of what I'm going to talk about today, especially this morning, I've presented on previously, but with the title of Mosaic of Metaphor. So the idea of all the metaphors for God in the Hebrew Bible being like little tiles that together create a big picture. And my reasoning for arguing that we look at the metaphors for God as each one part of something that makes a bigger picture is that I think that the multiplicity of imagery that's used in the biblical text about God is really there for a purpose. And that purpose includes sort of a continual call to humility, specifically theological humility, where we maintain a sense that when we talk about God using language from our everyday lived experience, we are attempting, we are just touching the beginning of a mystery, something beyond us, right? And to engage with each other in a way where we're continually aware of the fact that our language for God and for the divine human relationship is always going to be inherently limited. I think that also allows us not only to maintain a sense of humility toward God, but also in our interactions with each other, where we can allow ourselves to share freely about what images are most helpful and healing for us, right, at various points in our journey as we think about God. But also if someone else sitting next to us, has a visceral reaction, maybe opposite of ours. So let's say someone is listening to the imagery from the Hebrew Bible about God as a mother, and maybe in their childhood, they were deeply harmed by their own mother. So that is imagery that for one person could be really healing and could make a person feel held, nurtured, cared for. And for another person, it could bring up all kinds of reactions that actually cut off relationship or make relationship and connection hard. And so I think recognizing the multiplicity of metaphors in the Bible not only allows us to cultivate continued humility toward God, but also humility in our interactions with each other, that we are open to the fact that these images and the way we experience and even the way, one is helpful or another is not, really there's room for all of that. The Bible makes clear that there's room for all of these different metaphors. So the thing for us to think about as we start out is just that, as Rabbi Jonathan Sacks says, really there's no language in the Bible about God that is not metaphorical. Like all language about God is metaphorical. And, the Bible writers were masters of metaphor, masters. So thinking of the writers as artists and the use of metaphor as the honing of a skill of an amazing craftsmanship way with words. Aristotle is credited with saying that the greatest thing by far is to be a master of metaphor. So the biblical authors are incredibly skilled at using imagery. And before I open it up for us all to reflect together on, what metaphors, images for God are most common to us or most helpful for us, I think it would be good for us to start just by talking about what is metaphor. Metaphor essentially means transference. So in other words, like where I take, if you think of maybe a word bubble where, we could give a child a piece of paper with a word written in the middle and then do this connotation map where you write down, like, let's say the imagery of justice and righteousness in the Hebrew Bible flowing like a stream, like a never failing river, a stream. So that's an image, right? We could write stream or ever flowing river in the middle and then just put all the connotations. Pure water, you're never touching the same drops twice if you put your finger in the stream, right? It's carried on by a force beyond itself. People can enter it at any point and become part of the stream. And you could just keep going, connotations associated with that image. And so what we're doing with metaphor is we're taking whatever connotations we bring connected with a certain word. So if we put the word in the middle and we have all these connotations that for us are attached to that word because of our lived experience, our training, our sociocultural setting, all kinds of things impact what those are going to be. But we're basically taking those and mapping them on to, in the case of our discussion today, God, right? So going back to the idea of God as mother, if someone had a cluster of connotations of the idea of mother, and they're when they read a text like, can a mother forget her nursing child, or not have compassion for the child of her womb? Yes, even they might forget, but I, Yod He Vav He, I, the Lord, will not forget you. See, I have etched you in my palm. So someone could read that text and you have there God portrayed as a mother with a nursing child. And you could then imagine that anybody reading that text is then mapping on to the idea of God, whatever connotations that they have attached because of their experience and background and sociocultural setting with nursing mothers. And that's happening with all, right? When we say God is a rock, it's the same thing. We're mapping on. And so metaphor at its most basic is transferring, talking about one thing in terms of another, but those two things are not the same thing. When I say the Lord is a rock, I am not trying to say the Lord is a rock, as in a static object that's hard when you kick it, right? I'm mapping on certain connotations associated with rocks. So a few other things I'll say. Metaphor, you could say, is not just about describing, but it's also about comprehending one thing in terms of another. So it's not just a matter of, language is never a matter of just description, but it's part of the process of comprehending. And so when we describe one thing in terms of another, we are in the process of comprehending or understanding one thing in terms of another. It's also important to note, and this is really relatively recent, the last few decades, there was a long time when people talked about metaphor just as one of many fancy literary devices. Like, why not say it really in a fancy way, put in a metaphor or imagery into a poem rather than just saying the point that you want to make. But that is no longer how people generally see metaphor. People who research the human mind and how we think, and also scholars of language and literature, are increasingly saying, no, metaphor is not a fancy rhetorical device or literary device. It is the way that we experience and make sense of the world. Like you think in terms like time is a thief, right? That's a metaphor. You can think of examples. I'm trying to think. One article I read had a really good one, and now I'm blanking on the specific example, but we almost constantly think about or understand one thing in terms of another. One study actually listened to a whole bunch of human interactions, people talking to each other, and they measured the presence of metaphor in that conversation, like every 20 or 30 seconds, which if you think about it is astounding. We're literally engaging all day, every day in metaphor. And so I'm looking here. I think the last thing that I would say is one person who writes about metaphor, she talks about metaphor being both a process but also a process of thought. And as a process of thought, so when she says that, she's talking about how metaphor allows us to reorganize, condense, and vivify. So like bring life, right? It brings something to life. And metaphor as a process of thought allows new insights to emerge and different or deeper levels of meaning to be tapped. And let me think, there's one more quote I have here, but I don't think we necessarily need it. I suppose it's worth pointing out again, because we might easily fall into reading a metaphor in the Bible and thinking like identifying this as a metaphor, noticing what literary devices are being used here is the goal. But James Geary in his book, I Is an Other, The Secret Life of Metaphor and How It Shapes the Way We See the World. He says metaphor is a way of thought long before it is a way with words. So just another way to say the same thing. Metaphor is sort of how we are in the world. So I want to start out straight away by inviting some reflection, and I would like you to write down one or both of these things. The first question is just thinking back. I don't know how many of you have background in church or religious communities or families, but I'm guessing most of us do. And that background is probably more than just the last few weeks, right? There's some depth to it, some longitudinal experience that we have in religious communities. And if that's the case, I'm really interested in what comes to your mind as the metaphor for God that you have heard most often. So if you just think back overall, what is the metaphor for God you have heard most often? And then I'm also interested in us taking a moment to just think about the metaphor for God that each of us at this point, right? This can change, but at this point in our journey, in our spiritual life, what is the metaphor for God that you are finding most personally like healing, helpful, meaningful, significant to you right now? So I want to leave a little bit of time for us to reflect on this. And I'm actually going to type both of these questions into the chat, and then I'm going to unshare my screen for a little bit, just in case any of you are watching on a device where you can't see other people while looking at my screen. All right, so those questions should be visible in the chat. And once we've had each of us a time to reflect a bit on this, I invite you to unmute. Let's share some of these with each other. Yeah, Richard.
Well, obviously the most common metaphor in the past has been God the Father. And I know that's objectionable to some individuals.
Yeah, that is common, probably because most of us early in life memorized the Lord's Prayer, right? That's one of the early texts that we are deeply familiar with. And starting out there, our Father, which art in heaven, and perhaps there's other things that contribute to that also. So God as Father being very common.
Certainly God the Creator as well.
Mm-hmm.
God, the jealous God.
Mm.
It's in the Ten Commandments.
Yep. Carla, it looked like you were also going to say something.
Well, I was going to comment on God the Father because that's the metaphor that strikes me most frequently. And as you go through life, it has different meanings.
Yes.
And as a child, I liked the idea of God the Father because I didn't have to be responsible for making all those decisions.
Mhm.
And protection, lots of issues about having a father figure who is strong and powerful. Then when you get to the early adulthood, you don't want a powerful figure telling you what to do anymore.
Mhm.
But now as I'm getting older, I'm ready to give up some of that responsibility to be in charge of everything. And it's a cycle of life issue to me a little
Yeah.
bit. So I read it differently at different stages of my life.
Yeah. And that would be true for so many different metaphors, I think. Perhaps particularly the relational ones, because those are things, right, that have tremendous shifts over different seasons of life. But I think it would be true even of others.
Yeah, it's, especially since my father has passed away almost 30 years ago,
Yeah.
it's something I miss, I mourn.
Yeah. And so then God as Father almost becomes a way of leaning into those longings.
You're right.
Yeah. Yeah, Richard. Oh, it looks like you might be muted.
In the chat, Vera's iPhone says the Good Shepherd.
Yes. That's another one I think is one of the first ones that comes to people's mind when thinking about this question, the most, the metaphor for God that you've heard most often. And I wonder if that also is because of texts like the 23rd Psalm, where early on in our lives, many of us memorize, the Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want.
There's also the vine and the branches.
Yes. Anyone else thoughts on the most common or, the most meaningful, helpful or healing metaphor for God? Go for it, Richard.
One of my grandmother's favorite songs was The Potter and the Clay.
Yeah. That almost ties in with what you said earlier, God the Creator. I've really enjoyed the last few years, like thinking of some of those things under a bigger umbrella metaphor, and that is God as artist. It helps me kind of capture the dynamic nature of divine human relations, that God is always creating and inviting us to co-create with him.
We were talking about, and you were mentioning in your talk last night, Abraham Joshua Heschel. And as you talk about how different metaphors can be meaningful or then even potentially harmful, he has a quote that says, "Any God who is a God for me, but not for you, is an idol." And it's just interesting to, as you put on a different lens, like Father God can be a really good thing, unless you have an abusive father. Same thing as you mentioned with mother. If your perspective with mother and the imagery and the metaphor that comes to mind is all negative, well, maybe take that off the table. Try something else on.
Yeah, that's a beautiful invitation to hold space, right, for whatever our current experience is, and also, recognition that our experience, our perception is partial, and that we are actually enriched by, I don't know, how would you say that? Expanding, pulling up seats at the table for people who have different experiences with a given metaphor or idea about God.
Well, I was thinking as the pastor was talking that so many of the metaphors, especially the ones in the Old Testament, like the potter and the clay and the vine and the branches, have and even father and shepherd all have an idea of human beings being subordinate to God. They're the underlings and he's the head honcho. I mean, why not be, why not be the hands of the potter instead of the clay?
The clay.
Yeah. So, I think the whole tension about how much are we responsible for what happens in our lives versus how much can we not be responsible for? I think
Yeah.
about the issues that we cannot control. Right now, we feel totally helpless with the war going on in Ukraine. And when Mount St. Helens exploded 40 some years ago, we all felt helpless. I mean, there are times where you cannot be in charge and you have to say God's in charge.
Yeah. Yeah, Richard.
Just as far as God's in charge, that brings up the text that Dr. Washburn was uncomfortable with last night about the death of the 35-year-old mother. And it was not part of God's will in Dr. Washburn's view. In my view, it was not part of God's plan. It's something that happened. And Rick Rice has written a book on this subject, and that's undergoing a thorough discussion at Loma Linda right now over the 6 weeks down there. Anyway, it's a very important topic that I just needed to react to as far as God's will.
Yeah, one other thing, as Carla was talking, one other thing that struck me is Richard Rice also, when he talks more broadly about, like, I mean, in his discussions of Christian theology, let's say more broadly, he talks about the worldview, I suppose, of the biblical authors, and he describes it as everything belongs to one of two categories: either the creator God or creation. And from the perspective of the biblical writers, humans are part of the creation, right along with the rocks and the animals and all of these other elements. And that's been helpful for me, I guess, to think of that, right, to have that perspective named, because when Carla was talking, that's sort of what came to mind, that really does come through strongly, right? Humans are lumped with the creation very explicitly in the biblical text. And Carla, you were going to say something else also.
Yeah, I was going to ask you a question. You're dealing with young adults every day in your classroom, and I have had my years of doing that too. How do they react to the metaphors we've just talked about?
I think it again varies tremendously. Just reading through people's engagement, for instance, the class that I teach most often is the class on the prophetic literature in the Hebrew Bible. And reading through the students' engagement with those texts, I mean, the variation is huge. They can read the exact same text, and one will say, this is just amazing. God is so forgiving and so constantly reinitiating relationship and constantly inviting humans to partner with him, etc. And someone else in the same class will read the same text and just to, experience it as a sign of, I guess, belief in God, or even Christianity as a cult where there's somebody up above who's saying, almost like many people have pointed out how some of the language that we use for talking about God and Christianity it aligns in some ways with codependency, where you are not enough and you need me. And I will help you. And then you have to accept my help. And so some students, just whatever text they look at, they see this very arbitrary kind of God far away up in the sky. Kind of, we could say with the puppet strings, and this is partly why being in the classroom, it has really forced me to pause and learn about how our minds work, not just in processing metaphor, but just overall, how do we make sense of life? Because being in that space day after day with 30, 40, 50 students who can experience the same material so tremendously differently, it's just, it's sort of right in front of me all the time, how much we bring to the table from our own. Some of it is subconscious, it's like in our bodies, and we aren't even at a point where we can notice it or identify it. and some of it is, they've really processed it and thought about it, but the whole range, it's amazing. Kevin, you were going to say something.
Yeah, on that note, same reflection. I'd be really curious. So in May, I'm hoping to do a series on the character of God. And one of the things that I really want to address is what was mentioned by, I think Curtis at the beginning. So the terminology, metaphor, jealous God, depending on your lens, the way that you react to that is going to be very different. And it can sound very negative. I'd be curious, have you and your students discussed that one, or what's your personal thoughts on the jealous God as it enters into the 10 Commandments and elsewhere?
Yeah, that is a fascinating discussion. I used to have students present on that every year in Hebrew class. And I've kind of switched my set of texts. So we're not reading that particular text this year, but I think that you're absolutely right that the way someone experiences that text is deeply, deeply informed by, let's say, the word jealous, right? And then what would be the cluster of connotations and images that come to their mind when they hear that word? And one interesting thing, I guess, in Hebrew is the idea of the word can be translated jealous, but also like zealous. So the idea of really caring deeply about something. And we all know that that can be an incredible force for good, but that can also go wrong real easily. Like I suppose we're most familiar with the word zealous from like the reputation of the zealots at the time of Jesus Christ, and how quick they might have been to employ violence, for instance. But yes, I won't say too much more here other than I think students' relational experiences deeply impact how they read a text like that. And I'm happy to send you, Kevin, more, I can send you info on that word if you'd like to do a more extensive treatment of it in your series, because I think there is a lot there.
Pardon me for breaking in. I'm having a technical problem here, not getting my picture on the screen anymore, only the audio. But from that same commandment, it says, visiting the sins of the father upon the children unto the third and fourth generation. That is unjust, punishing children for the sins of the father.
Mm-hmm. That also is a fascinating discussion. I think particularly in the context of like our growing knowledge of how human bodies and minds work. I'm trying to think. I feel like recently my therapist was telling me that the, trauma or painful experiences, elements of life can be passed down for 14 generations. And so, that's an interesting question to ask. How much of this, again, like our perception of God is going to color our reading of that? If we see God in the sky as, I suppose, that really separate, distant figure who is reaching down to control, then the idea of like, oh, look, little Johnny was just born. Time to make sure that he experiences some of the evil that his parents earned, that we could see it that way, but there's also the sense in which inherent in there is perhaps the idea of a caring figure who is limiting that generational impact that we know more and more about every year. I mean, the research being done on that is just tremendous. These are very good questions to ask and to sit with. Sometimes also I notice there's a gap between the intellectual, like for instance, let's take this idea of God as jealous or zealous. Okay, I can intellectually have studied this out and realize, oh, in some ways this wording really celebrates the relational aspect of God and the way that God engages with humanity. And I can also be aware of epigenetics and the research about intergenerational trauma and all kinds of other things that I'm learning about. But at the same time, the connotation of an abusive, like an emotionally abusive relationship, is one of the connotations for me associated with the word jealous. Okay, like someone saying, oh, I don't want you to go out with your friends because I don't know what you're going to do or who you're going to talk to. I want you to only be with me. It has connotations of an emotionally abusive relationship for me also. And it's just interesting to sort of be aware of that I can learn about epigenetics. I can learn about the facets of that word and how it's used. And yet when I hear it, right, Curtis, when I heard you say out loud, you know, I am a jealous God visiting the iniquities of the fathers upon the children to the third and fourth generations, you know, I still feel this little, sort of, right? There's within me and that can both be happening at the same time. And perhaps those elements are interacting in our experience more often than we realize.
I put this observation in the chat, but I was thinking of, we haven't had too many metaphors from the New Testament other than the Good Shepherd, but Jesus is frequently referred to as the master or the teacher. Yep. And I've had enough experience with young people to know that that can be either a positive or a negative figure.
Depending on their experience.
Yeah, the teacher can be the mentor who is greatly valued, or the teacher can be some jerk you despise and don't have any respect for. Yeah. And also there's the fact that young people often see themselves as having no power over whether they learn or succeed, and the teacher has all the power.
Yeah.
So it's a complicated metaphor.
That's so interesting to hear you say, because I feel like that those connotations associated with teaching, it's something that I confront on a daily basis, partly because I very much understand myself, I suppose, as a teacher, as a facilitator of a learning environment, rather than a conveyor of information. And, you know, in higher education, that's just frankly not accepted. There are people who appreciate that here and there, but overall, the general messaging that I, as a young faculty member, get is that that's not teaching, right? You should go in and tell them what they should know, and they should sit and listen to you. And it's so interesting to even, you know, think about that. I mean, I'm working from basically the philosophy that was partly articulated by Bell Hooks. She wrote about, in her book, Teaching to Transgress, about teaching as an exercise in freedom. And she talks a lot about collaboration in the classroom, where you go in and it's a mutual learning experience. And she was writing about this decades ago. It's not a new idea. It's just not widely appreciated or accepted in higher education. And imagine, depending on your perspective on what teaching is, how different those texts in the New Testament you might experience them.
Breaking in one more time. Your comment about abusive relationships reminds me of what Jesus said to the disciples. They must forsake father, mother, brother, sister. He who would not do that is not worthy of me and cannot be my disciple.
That's another one, right? No matter how much we intellectually find ways to make sense of a text like that, I think for me, you know, I experience a sort of physiological like shrinking or, you know, reaction to the text.
I like the use of the metaphor as a word. And when I think of the word, you know, that in the beginning there was the word, I always think about this process of creation through, you know, transferring energy into matter. Mm-hmm. And how powerful that is. And then the second one out of the same thing is logos, and out of the same thing again, the word that is depth of understanding and communication. And so there, it has so many different layers. Just a single metaphor has so many different layers that can be used.
Yeah, that's beautiful. And some of those, I mean, I appreciate so much, I suppose, how, like the example that you just gave, it's almost a thread through the entire biblical text. And just like metaphors come and into sort of emphasis at different points in our lives, and then might subside, and we might find other language or metaphors more helpful. Some of those threads come up in the biblical text with different nuances at different points in the unfolding story.
Yeah,
Bernard.
Hi, thanks. I want to respond to the text that Curtis brought up about you must forsake your father, mother, and sibling. So for most, fortunately, it seems almost unkind or crude or unfathomable. But for some, in unique circumstances, it's comforting, it's guidance, almost instructional. As in my case, when I was converted and wanted to be baptized and be a Christian, my parents objected strongly, and they actually disowned me and kicked me out of the house, and I had to leave. And it was anguishing for me to experience something like this. That text was, it was almost instructional. And so I guess the broader point is metaphors, parables, and many of, the way that God speak and Jesus spoken stories are not meaningful to a lot of people. However, for people with unique circumstances and context, God was speaking. God does not speak very specifically about a lot of things, but very generally, because he knows he was speaking through generations, thousands of years. And we all come with our own perspective, like you have said. So I think that's helpful to know.
Yeah, thank you so much for saying that, because it makes me realize how I think part of the reactionary element, where I say, like, I feel maybe shame or something creeping, like redness creeping up my middle and a little bit resistant. Some of that comes from the fact that we as humans, I think maybe, I don't know why we do this, maybe as a reaction when we feel a need for control, or maybe we need to think that our experience is universal in order to legitimize our experience. I'm not sure, but people have used texts like that to tell other people what to do. Like, don't you see? It says here, leave your father and mother, And I think that, Bernard, what you've shared shows that these passages are all part of we could even go beyond saying mosaic of metaphor in scripture. We could say the mosaic of scripture, this huge library of texts that came together over thousands of years from so many different people and places. And that mosaic of scripture has a word for everybody. But that
I
word
want
is
to add that you conveyed a powerful paradigm of giving space to an idea, to an like metaphor, and in your classroom and all. I think we can extend that metaphor, that paradigm vertically upwards. We need to give God space.
Yes.
Okay. And I think the challenge of the Christian experience is to go from the natural inward looking, right, to outward looking horizontally. But then, we need to really, accept the sovereignty of God, and really that this fella has existed like the Highlanders over centuries and thousands of years. And we need to really, give ourselves permission and scope to expand our imagination, to take ourselves to where God will take us, and push our comfort zone. And really, the notion of giving space to God is very important.
Yeah. And in many ways, I feel like some of the early education that we get makes that hard. I mean, that one, for instance, the one line it is in the Bible. There's a line that says, I, the Lord, do not change. And that's something that people love to quote, especially in my experience when young people are bringing up questions, right? Where they're trying to make sense of what is this stuff we believe about God and humanity, and how does it mesh with my lived experience? And I mean, that's one line, but to allow ourselves not to try to seek absolute, right? To be able to say, I have arrived, I have a full understanding of God, and I know God doesn't change, and therefore my understanding of God is the full one, and you should adopt it as well. It really hinders, I think, what you're describing as this spiritual journey where we can always allow the dynamic, emergent relationship to be unfolding, even when we don't understand. Perhaps we often don't understand.
If I could say something else, I think this text that Curtis mentioned, where that they should leave their father and mother and sister and brother, isn't the same thing said for a man when he's going to marry, that he's going to leave his father and his mother and cleave to his wife. And so I think it's the extension of the same picture, of the same meaning, not necessarily that you leave them forever and never talk to them again, but you're changing your or shifting the focus. What is the most important thing in your life?
Mm-hmm.
Because you are growing, you're maturing in your relationship, and so you are cleaving to God more than you cleave to anybody else. And then secondly, you are invited to give your loyalty, to shift your loyalty from when you were a child to now that you are an adult. And so I think this is a much wider picture than people most of the time think.
Yeah. Thank you. That's beautiful. Any other thoughts on these questions before we go on?
Breaking in again.
Yeah, go for it.
Read the Old Testament and see the actions which are attributed to Yahweh. And then tell me, where does the conviction come from that God is good?
Mm-hmm. That question, begs another question also, and that is, how do we understand texts that attribute actions to Yahweh? I mean, that I think is a question we have to ask when we recognize these texts are coming to us from so many different places and people. Over time, there certainly seems to be a unifying, threads that go through, but my goodness, it seems to me that, like, for myself personally, to make sense of some of these texts, I cannot see it as a full understanding. I have to see it as someone's, I suppose, the closest language that they could find to describe their experience at that time.
I'm thinking, for example, of the story familiar to you of the man who was found picking up sticks on the holy Sabbath day, probably to cook a meal for his family. Someone noticed and ratted him out, and they asked God what should be done. And the reply, which occurs almost every time, Surely he must be put to death.
Yeah. I can't help thinking as you're saying that of how we still do that today. It's easy to, I suppose, find ourselves in a story unfolding very much like that one, where I suppose, and this might sound strong, but we participate in violence and other actions and understand it as the direct will of God. Any other comments before I will I think I'll share my screen because I have a couple of longer quotes, and I know personally I have a hard time listening to people talk long term. I need to be able to see as I go, so I do want to share my screen and let you read along with some of these. But any other thoughts on most common metaphor, or your the metaphor or imagery that you find most healing, helpful, meaningful at this point in your life? Yeah, Carolyn. Do you know, I might have to ask my assistant here to unmute you. Do you know how to do that?
Carolyn will unmute herself.
Okay.
Carolyn? Oh, we can ask her.
Here we go.
unmute. Oh, there she is.
We got you
Had to
now.
get my screen in position to find the icon.
Yep.
It will come as no surprise to most of these people that I think of God sometimes as a bird. As in Psalm 91, he will shelter you under his feathers and his wings. And that's a comfort to me that he will protect me.
Yeah, that's so beautiful. And to add to the richness of the metaphorical language, the Bible uses so many different birds for that metaphor, right? We have the chicken and the eagle, and yeah.
Well, the
Right.
good thing about the bird metaphor is there's a sense of the bird's eye view of the whole world.
Yep.
Perspective that we cannot adopt on our own unless we have a drone today.
Yeah. Yeah. And that also, that view makes me think about how, like, imagine this, how many metaphors in the Bible, and this is true in the New Testament as well as the Hebrew Bible, but they're very agricultural. They're coming out of an agrarian society or a semi-nomadic society, even some of them. And, many people today just have zero reference point for that imagery, right? They've never walked a field. They've never harvested something. They've never, watched the seasons in order to plant a successful crop and see it through to fruition. And that the idea, for instance, even going to the shepherd, God is a shepherd. Imagine how we might read that at different points in our life. If, say, at one point in our life, we maybe like engaged with someone who actually works as a shepherd and walked with them as they led their flocks around, or even reading the text alongside someone who has firsthand experience of that part, that, that facet of life, we're going to experience that metaphor differently also. So I feel like that perspective taking, the bird's eye view, or the way that the imagery gives different views, is true even over the course of our lifetime, even of the not so, not the relational, like father and child metaphors, but of the broader ones as well. Well, let me share my screen, and I'll share with you a few, some information from two people particularly I'm going to be sharing from primarily. One is William Brown, and the other is Eugene Peterson. So this book that I'm citing from William Brown is a book particularly about imagery, but he's also writing particularly about the book of Psalms. But I think that many of the points that he makes apply more broadly as well. So he mentions the book of Psalms, but I think the points he makes about imagery also are helpful, even going out from the Psalms and looking at the wider biblical text and the uses of imagery. So William Brown talks about the Psalms as Scripture's most integrated corpus. On David's many-stringed lyre, as it were, there can be heard almost every theological chord that resounds throughout the Hebrew Scriptures, from covenant and history to creation and wisdom. In the Psalms, the God who commands is also the God who sustains, the God of royal pedigree and the God of the poor and needy, the God of judgment and the God of healing. God's hidden face and God's beaming countenance are all profiled in the Psalter. And he goes on to say that such an eclectic portrayal of the divine is consonant with an equally thick profile of the human self. The public and private spheres, corporate worship and inner devotion find their nexus in the Psalms. From anger to adulation, the various Psalms cover the gamut of human emotion and response to God's presence in the world or lack thereof. That's probably supposed to be God's presence in the world or lack thereof. All that is humanly experienced is related to God. Knowledge of self and knowledge of God, to utilize Calvin's categories, are inseparably bound. With its jagged edges yet luminous intensity, the Psalter presents the rich mosaic of faith, pieced together from Israel's turbulent history and cultural diversity. The Psalms at once caress and assault the soul. They orient, disorient, and reorient. They scale the heights of praise as well as plumb the depths of despair. So Brown is talking, generally about the Psalms, and I think it's worthwhile to note here that some of the points that he's making apply not only to imagery but also to emotional experience. So the sense in which in the biblical text we have a portrayal of the full range of human experience. And interestingly, the Bible does not seem shy about attributing that full range also to God, which I think is a reflection of how comfortable we might say God as allowing so much human involvement in, for instance, the writing, the carrying on through the generations, the passing on of the biblical text seems, if I zoom out to a bigger picture view, seems quite comfortable with this full range in both how people perceive him and also in how the text portrays the human experience. But I want to go to a little summary of some material that comes from Eugene Peterson's book called Answering God, where he talks about the Psalms. And he has a little, very short chapter, but with lots of punch there about metaphor particularly. And he makes this argument that the use of metaphor is very significant in protection against idolatry. And when he talks about this, he makes some comparisons. So for instance, he says that metaphor expands and connects, whereas an idol reduces and confines. And then he talks about how a metaphor starts with something common, so some element of human lived experience, and then lets it expand into something immeasurable. So starting with something, physical, this is the common one, right? Imagine if we wrote a metaphor using a mask, we're all engaging with that. But whatever it was, a rock, piece of wheat. And in contrast to that, an idol starts with a mystery We could think in terms of, some divine being, a god, or one of the many gods of the ancient world, starts with a mystery and fashions it into something that can be measured. And then he says that a metaphor puts materiality into speech. The moment the word is spoken, it is no longer under control, but is the subject of the spontaneous dynamics of conversation in which a living God is partner. This is something I want to talk about more this afternoon when we gather. The element of embracing that dynamic aspect of the divine human relationship. But in contrast to that, he says that an idol gathers divinity into a lump, sometimes a very elegant and finely crafted lump, but a lump nonetheless that can be controlled. And some of these reflections from Eugene Peterson, to me, they're not only helpful in examining how a metaphor might function in a human journey with God, a human journey toward flourishing and well-being, whatever that might look like for each person. But it's also helpful to me in just pulling me back to the need for the multiplicity of metaphors. Again, that when we talk about God, all of our language is inherently limited and inherently deeply shaped by our lived experience. And therefore, the multiplicity of metaphors is absolutely necessary. So I want to take you back to William Brown's work for a moment and just share one more quote. Brown says that when metaphors become literalized to the point that they exclude other metaphors for the same object or target domain, particularly in the case of God, they function as idols. To put this theologically, if any metaphor, no matter how profound, becomes absolutized, as though it were itself considered ultimate, then idolatry becomes the norm. So this sense of the need for many metaphors has been expressed many different ways. This line is attributed to Zohar. If you want to use a metaphor, use many metaphors. So don't settle for one. I also noticed I don't know if any of you watched The Chosen, this multi-season series about the life of Christ, but they did a little Christmas episode. And as part of that, they had this scene where somebody stood and just recited the many, 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 many names for God in the Bible. And if you think of names were not chosen at that point because they sounded nice, like sometimes we do today, but they all had meanings. And in the episode of The Chosen, after they listed off all these names for God, they basically explained that this multitude of names is important because God is so ineffable that language could not capture his image any more than a graven image could. So all kinds of reminders, from different authors, different perspectives about this idea that each of our attempts to talk about God are inherently metaphorical, where we're transferring connotations from our lived experience onto our comprehension of the divine. And they are limited, and therefore, the more we have, right, the more we allow space for many, many metaphors, the less likely we are to become, I suppose, overly attached to one, to the point where I don't think this is too strong to say, but where we mistreat other people, fellow people on the journey, if they don't share the same favorite metaphor for God. So coming to the end, and I would like to open up for more discussion, but I'll just say, sort of the main things that I take away from this discussion or this reflection is that the Bible really extends an invitation to hold metaphors loosely, not only from season to season in our own lives, but also loosely in our engagement with each other, that we can allow space for different language. Also a call to use a variety of metaphors. and to remember that all metaphors are talking about one thing in terms of another. It's just interesting to me that we find it so much easier to apply that in some places than others. Like, I don't think nobody gets into an argument about like if God is actually a rock or not. But we often argue about, is God a father? And if so, how are you understanding that? And it's just interesting to think about how this idea of, remembering how metaphors function and that they're always inherently talking about or moving us toward comprehending one thing in terms of another, how we sometimes, move away from that. So I have a couple of quotes that I want to read to you that I don't have typed out on the screen, but one is coming from a rabbi, and she is calling for I suppose you could call it a freshening up of metaphor that we use for talking about the divine human relationship. And she makes this argument based on, the richness of metaphor, but also a recognition that the lived experience of people today is not the same in many cases as the world of the Bible. But she says, once upon a time, our ancestors employed a rich palette of metaphors to shape their experiences of the divine. Metaphors that spoke directly to their everyday experiences. My hope is that we can recapture the aliveness which once pervaded our holy texts and reconstruct our metaphors so that they are once again engaging and meaningful. So that's Rabbi Toba Spitzer talking about metaphor and calling people to really, really delve into finding language that is resonant and alive today. Another person who has really gotten me thinking about this is Dr. Yolanda Pierce. She wrote a book last year called In My Grandmother's House. And she's talking about, in many ways, the journey of growing up, where you have to wrestle with what you take with you from your family, and then in what ways you reimagine, you innovate. And every generation does this, right? In some ways we protect and carry forth some things, and in other ways we move in a different direction or we innovate in some way. And she talks about, well, I'll read part of this quote, and then I'll talk about some of the examples that she shares. But she says, our limited human language fails in our efforts to describe God and God's love for us. We struggle to articulate the complexities of our faith, and so we draw on imagery from ordinary life to explain the extraordinary. We grope for words, sensing our inadequacy to summarize the mysteries of the faith. Yet, it is problematic when symbolic language become the default without any acknowledgement that there are real people and weighty historical context underneath the metaphors. So she's talking as a Black woman who grew up and saw the way that some of the disparities between white and Black people's experience affected her own, her family, herself, and the generations before her. And she talks about metaphors like, for instance, blackness and whiteness. Okay, this is metaphorical language that we find in the text, where whiteness is, for instance, portrayed as a symbol of purity, cleanness. She also talks about the master-slave metaphor and how common that is. And then the idea of soldier or battle. This one always comes up for me when I'm listening to kids' songs. I mean, we teach kids at age 3 to sing, "We are soldiers in the army." And so some of these metaphors, she talks about how, they serve a purpose. They're one of countless metaphors. But when we're using a given metaphor in a certain context, we absolutely must remember, she says, words matter. Symbols are heavy, laden with meaning and history. And we must be mindful of the metaphors that we're using. And some metaphors in some contexts just are not helpful or healing. She talks about, for instance, a period in her life where she just had to completely eliminate the metaphor of master and slave out of her idea of what it means to be a Christian, because she was learning so much about her history and her family's history. That metaphor was not helpful or healing in any way. And so there's a sense in which we have this ongoing responsibility, I think, to think about the metaphors that we use, not only in our own lives, but how they might be experienced by people around us, and to be willing to let certain metaphors go, to embrace certain metaphors in a responsive and bigger relational picture kind of way. And then one last thing is I think that there is an invitation, which somebody already mentioned earlier, but the idea to continue in a relationship of unknowing. So just this idea that our language is capturing glimpses, for instance, of God, but not the totality. God remains a mystery. So even if we have our favorite metaphors for God, there is an invitation toward sort of leaning into this unknowing. There's one, I'll share this one example. John O'Donohue tells about Colombian writer Gabriel Garcia Marquez, who was asked by his friend and fellow writer Mendoza in a wonderful collection of conversations, what did he think of his wife, Mercedes? Marquez, who had been with Mercedes for 40 years at that time, said to Mendoza, "I know her so well now that I haven't the slightest idea who she is." And O'Donohue says, like this, that is familiarity as an invitation to absolute wonder. And that is a posture that I see, modeled, I think, by the biblical writers. So I have, I want to invite reflection on some of these things. And I also want to type maybe into the chat this one question. And then I'm going to unshare my screen in case I'm obscuring anybody's, but I can see your hand. So if anyone wants to comment, you're welcome at this time.
So has the well gone dry, pardon the metaphor?
Oh, you mean what I have to say?
No, what the people have to respond.
Oh, if it was almost lunchtime, I would say we're all just wanting the meeting to end because we want to go eat, but it's not quite lunchtime.
Well, I'll start with the discussion a little bit, but I would hope to see other people contribute. I've really appreciated your emphasis on relationship as it's reflected in the metaphors we've been talking about, that it's relationships can be permanent. And I think this is where the idea of the jealous God is there. You cannot erase the fact that you were married to someone, especially if you were married to someone and had children with that person. And yet I've gone to countless memorial services where the first spouse is never even mentioned.
Mm-hmm.
If the parent of the children is not even mentioned, and that those children cannot disown who their parents were.
Mm-hmm.
And maybe I would have hated my father had he lived longer. I had issues with him at times, but I can't deny the fact that he was my father. It's permanent in that respect. I think God is always there as that relationship, whether we choose to act on it or not. Our parents can disown us, but they are still our parents. and we can disown our children, but they're still our children. I have a young relative who had a very severely disabled child who died a year ago at the age of 16. And that young woman is still identifying herself as the grieving mother of a child who had a severe disability. I don't know if she'll ever be able to go past that part of her identity, even though she has a totally well other child.
Yeah. Our relationships form us.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And I think that's one of the beautiful parts again of the Psalms, that we're not told to get over our grief. You know, we find language for it, we integrate it along with our joy and longings, and it's right there woven into our experience individually and communally. Richard, you were going to say something.
Yeah, I appreciate your emphasis on what is unknowable. I'm a pathologist, and I frequently see uncertainty, sometimes expressed in pathology reports. In fact, I just saw one this morning that had a descriptive diagnosis, not a diagnosis of a specific disorder, but just describing what was seen under the microscope. And it was interesting to read the clinical differential diagnoses and realize that none of those were confirmed or excluded by the descriptive diagnosis that was given. So more clinical follow-up may show what the disorder is, and perhaps another biopsy of a fresh lesion might show what the disorder is. But there is uncertainty in this world. There's a lot of uncertainty there, and things that are just unknowable. And so I appreciate your emphasis of that point.
Yeah. And despite what they say about us, you know, once we reach a certain point in life, we start calcifying. Despite that, I think there is an invitation extended to us to maintain a certain malleability in our hearts, you know, an ability to sit with the discomfort of not knowing, or to enter into relational spaces that we really frankly can't control. We don't know what will emerge. Because I think in many ways, those are the spaces where life is.
You mentioned earlier in the chat that you noticed that today is the anniversary of Dietrich Bonhoeffer's execution. And that indeed happened on April 9th, 1945. I was 1 day old. That was 3 days before Franklin Roosevelt died.
Wow.
And the week that, the end of the first week that Okinawa was invaded by US forces.
So much overlapping history there, huh? And happy birthday, as a side note. Not. If I hadn't lost my voice, I would sing happy birthday to you, but
77 years ago.
Well, happy birthday.
So I'm going to ask a personal question, because there may be some discussion about this in the afternoon session, which I'm not going to be able to attend probably. But I'm curious that you had experience as a minister of music. So tell us a little bit about your musical background and how that's still part of your identity.
Oh, yes. Well, I had a very strange childhood, like really strange. I grew up in the back of one of those Dodge vans that has the seat across the back, and then it's all empty in the middle, and then the two, front seats. And the van was filled with equipment because my dad is a musician. He made his living playing sacred music on classical guitar, which is a niche if there was ever a niche. If you talk to someone who is a classical guitar fan and also appreciates sacred music, my dad is like the one, like the celebrity of all celebrities. But most people would have never heard of him. And so we grew up sort of spending the winter traveling around the country in the van giving music concerts, and then spending the spring and summer and fall gardening, because if anyone isn't aware, being a musician is really not generally a way to make a lot of money. So we sort of lived off the land when I was a child. And music is such a huge part of my life. I mean, I go home every day from work and I play my heart out on the piano. It's a way to regroup. And my daughter and I both have these long, colorful ribbons, and we do those ribbon twirling and dancing, singing to music. Yeah, very, very important to me. Although I still find myself, growing up in an environment where so much emphasis was put on performance. I can see how that plays out in my life now. Like for many years, I played pretty often in church services. And I noticed a pattern that even though I'm a trained musician, I studied music in college, I've taught music for most of my life, and such, I still kept noticing that every time I performed, I would somehow not prepare one part of it. And I'm starting to notice that in myself. Like I like to play now for fun, but I never like fully learn a song, even though technically like I'm trained. I know how to take a piece of music and like learn it carefully and well, but there's a part of me still pushing against that, right? And wanting to just play for fun. I just went to a book sale recently and picked up a whole bunch of new music, and I've just been playing through it for the fun of it and having a wonderful time, while missing half of the bass notes. But yeah, music is very, very important to me.
And how did you get to be a minister of music in Santa Barbara?
Just responded to a newspaper advertisement.
Were you in graduate school or something at the time?
No, we had just moved to Santa Barbara because my husband was going to be pastoring there. Okay. And so I was just like reading the classifieds every day. And that opened up for a while. Yeah. I imagine there are many other musicians here, and I would just say, I know we're closing soon, but I recently wrote a blog post about life as a process of making music in the tension. And it came out of a reference in a conflict workshop that I went to, where the presenter talked about how life is like a guitar string, how if you pull it too tight, it breaks. If you don't pull it enough, right? If there's not enough tension, it's just like plink, plink, right? No actual sound, but with just the right tension, you can make music. And I love that as the child of a guitarist, right? And as a pianist myself, that imagery was really meaningful to me. But Amanda, I see your hand up.
Hi, yes. I don't think any of you guys, I'm one of Kevin's friends and saw his post on Facebook, so I wanted to join. And I just wanted to say that I've really appreciated your explanations today about metaphors, and especially your last question in the chat as it relates to idolatry. I had never thought of that before, although I suppose Eugene Peterson would be a perfect person to comment on that, being that he paraphrased the message. But I think, if I'm not getting my names mixed up, but I just wanted to say that I really resonate with the idea that sometimes it's appropriate to shelve the parts of God. I don't even know if we can say it that strongly, but the ways that we see God, that we perceive God during certain parts of our lives, because it's just too painful. And I just really am grateful that I believe in a God that's big enough for me to do that, that is big enough for me to say, I don't really like that part of you right now, or what I perceive to be that part of you. And that he's big enough to say, that's okay, just love the rest of me, or whatever part of me you can tolerate, I'm okay with it. The fact that he is that big enough for me and for my story and my struggles. And I think one of my life goals as a Christian is to be, I'll obviously never be as big as God, but like to be big enough in that sense for other people, whether they're other Christians or non-believers, to say that's okay. Like, you don't have to see God how I see him. You can see him in whatever. I don't, I know that this starts to get uncomfortable, especially among Adventists, like relative truth and whatnot. And that's not really what I'm leaning towards. It's more just the relationship aspect that you talked about. If how we see God starts to cut off our relationship to him, sorry, I have a 4-year-old who's ready to go outside, then it defeats the purpose. The Bible in and of itself, the very existence of the Bible is actually a metaphor as I see it, because what are written letters? I mean, that's a very human thing. So the fact that God is even communicating to us like that in the first place is a metaphor, really. And so anyways, I don't want to babble. I just want to say that I very much appreciate this concept, and I'm going to continue to think about it, and hopefully be gracious to others as they are in their own journey for how they want to relate to God as well.
Yeah, thank you so much, Amanda. It's amazing to think about the like you said, oh, this is a new way to think, and it's new for me also. I mean, I literally just thought about this question of idolatry as a cutting off of relationship just this week, because I often have thought again of idolatry like God is up there and he's saying, how dare you have this gold-plated piece of wood in your house? But if you think, for instance, of the satirical poem in Jeremiah 10 that makes fun of the people for like having something, a God that they have to prop up and it can't speak and can't hear them and all of this. And it's making fun with these exaggerated descriptions of idolatry, you could say. But the whole point is relational. The call is for us to engage with a God who does see, who does hear, who is affected by, and who chooses to stand beside us. So this is, I'm also right there with you on this journey of thinking about this in terms of cultivating connection and relationship. But Richard, I think we're at the end of our time, so I'll let you.
We're at the end. We do have one more comment from Ann Buckingham. Welcome, Ann, in the chat. And so Jody, please take a look at her comment about God the Father.
Yeah, no, I agree. In some ways, I use the imagery of the possible harmful use of God as mother as a way of talking about this very issue that of how the image of God as father has been used in a way that might not feel. It gives us space, I suppose, because the not as many of us have been sort of forced, right, to think about God as mother. So maybe we're able to entertain the idea that different people would experience that metaphor differently based on their own story, their own context, their own lived experience. It can be a lot harder to entertain those possibilities in connection to the metaphor of God as father. But I think that we must.
I have a message for Dick.
Yes.
Happy birthday. Happy birthday. Pain and suffering everywhere. Never justice anywhere. Happy birthday. Happy birthday.
Thank you, Curtis. Much appreciated. And for those who didn't hear the discussion earlier about Dietrich Bonhoeffer, the reason that was mentioned as part of the recording today was that he is the subject of the conversation next week. 9 + 7 is April 16. And so there will be several individuals speaking about a film made about him and about and by a scholar from St. Olaf College. And Ken Walters talked about that earlier, and about the psychiatrist who will be talking about this, who's had an interest in the subject of Dietrich Bonhoeffer a long time. And so it is interesting that we are having this conversation on the 77th anniversary of his execution. Another thing that I don't think was part of God's will, but happened just because of bad things happen to good people, as let's see, the rabbi has written, and other people have written about that subject. Well, thank you very much for your very thoughtful presentation this morning, and thank everybody that made contributions this morning. And I hope there will be a full audience for you at 11 o'clock. Best wishes. I'm going to end the recording and the session right now. Thanks very much.